Let's start in a peaceful place. Somewhere among the mists. Somewhere you can hear the distant creak of old floors beneath boots and almost smell the sea salt in the air. Where the gray-wrapped sun comes late and the trees sway gently. It's the kind of setting where stories flow in like tidewater rather than shouting. San Juan Island is this. A piece of hazy earth that floats between the beaches of British Columbia and what is now Washington State. A location that was once the focal point of an international standoff, almost absent the United States and Great Britain, two strong empires, are on the verge of war in 1859. The spark? A pig. Indeed, an actual pig. Not a code word for a complicated process. It's not a metaphor. Only a pig. A ravenous pig. One who has little knowledge of diplomacy, treaties, or borders. One having a regrettable potato hunger. But let's broaden our perspective before delving into the potato patch where it all began. Let's take a look at 1859. Let's experience it. RDLY. Because bullet points don't capture the essence of history. It is momentary, inbred and breath and silent anxieties. The Pacific Northwest is still new, wild, and uncarved at this very time. It has a smoke and cedar scent. Birdsong and the sounds of newcomers pounding together futures out of bare would fill the air. The United States is developing quickly to the south, with its lungs spreading westward. There will be trains soon. Wires on telegraphs buzz. However, tensions are also escalating as a result of division, expansion, and slavery. Although no one is aware of it yet, the nation is headed into civil war. British Canada is spread out over a wide area to the north. The Hudson's Bay Company, which is essentially a fur-clad business empire, continues to be a powerful influence. Above seaside commercial posts, the British flag is respectfully flown by officers with sharp uniforms and calmer dispositions. San Juan Island floats between these realms. A verdant, steep wedge of pasture, mist, and rock. Valued for its strategic location rather than its wealth, soldiers, or resources. As you can see, it is located directly in the Haro Strait, which is one of the two primary shipping lanes connecting Vancouver Island and the mainland. You could control mobility if you could control San Juan. Reach, impact. That implied that you had a problem. Because America and Britain didn't exactly establish the northwest boundary when they signed the Oregon Treaty in 1846, which was intended to do just that. The border would pass through the middle of the channel that separates the continent from Vancouver Island, according to the treaty. Easy enough? Not even close. Because, spoiler alert, that description applies to two channels. To the west, the Haro Strait. To the east, the Rosario Strait. And in the exact middle of them, a group of islands. The islands of San Juan. Little, misty, and lovely. Apparently up for grabs as well. Both countries assumed ownership of them in silence. Through the Hudson's Bay Company, the British built Bellevue Sheep Farm, which is staffed with herds and employees and has legal documentation to support its existence. On the other side, the Americans promoted immigration under the pretext of American expansion. No side wanted to exert too much pressure. Not quite yet. It simmered, until a pig caused everything to boil over one July morning. Let's get to know our pig.it was a big, black boar, but no name has survived the archives. Owned by Hudson's Bay Company employee Charles Griffin, an Irishman. Griffin had a few buildings, a small plot of land, and a herd of pigs that were reportedly free to wander. Like pigs, American settler Lyman Cutlar resided just beyond the fence. Well, the invisible fence of the undetermined border. Calm, pragmatic, and prone to subtlety. He had very little. A harsh home, patch of potatoes, a rifle. When Cutlar went outdoors one morning in June 1859, he discovered the pig once more working his crop. Buried in potatoes. Chewing, snorting, and overall behaving like pigs. The incident wasn't the first. Cutlar had attempted to chase the thing away. Attempted to speak with Griffin. There had been no change. And something broke this time. Cutlar picked up his rifle, frustrated, maybe hungry, maybe just tired. He took aim. He fired. The pig fell. Just one pig. Dead. The powder trail had been lighted in an instant. There was neither a charge nor a gunfight that ensued. A sequence of progressively absurd diplomatic maneuvers ensued. Griffin, furious at the death of his pig, demanded compensation. Cutlar, who felt entirely justified, offered a modest sum, $10. Griffin scoffed. He valued the pig at $100. A ludicrous amount, thought Cutlar. He refused. Griffin went to his superiors. They went to their military contacts. British officials threatened to arrest Cutlar for shooting the pig on what they insisted was British soil. Cutlar, alarmed, went to American authorities in nearby Washington Territory, who, in turn, decided that this could not stand. A few weeks later, Captain George Pickett of the U.S. Army, yes, that Pickett, a future Civil War fame, was dispatched with a small force of American soldiers to occupy San Juan Island and defend American settlers. Pickett planted the U.S. flag and declared that any attempt by the British to arrest an American citizen on American soil would be considered an act of war. The British responded by sending 3 warships. Not 1, not 2, 3, armed, anchored, cannons at the ready. You can almost picture it. Sails tightening in the breeze, officers peering through telescopes, soldiers polishing bayonets they hoped not to use. The island population? Dozens. The troops now stationed there? Hundreds. And the cause of all this? Still just one pig. Let's pause here. Let the image sink in. A small, forested island in the Pacific Northwest. American tents flapping in the wind. British ships bobbing off the coast. And a community of settlers, farmers, carpenters, shopkeepers, caught between 2 empires because of a farm animal and a bad border description. This is both hilarious and haunting, because even though no shots were fired yet, everything was in place. This was how wars often began in the 19th century, not with grand declarations, but with men of ambition making impulsive decisions on the edge of the known world. And Pickett was ambitious. He wasn't subtle. He wasn't diplomatic. He wanted to make a name for himself, and planting the U.S. flag on disputed land under threat of war was exactly the kind of headline he liked. The British, though rattled, didn't overreact. They could have fired, easily. Instead, they waited. And when tensions reached their peak, a cooler head arrived, General Winfield Scott. Scott was a veteran, a skilled negotiator, and perhaps most importantly, tired of unnecessary war. He sailed to the island, surveyed the ridiculousness, and offered a solution: joint occupation. Each side would station a small military detachment on the island, peacefully, while the governments back east and across the Atlantic sorted things out. A military standoff, without fighting. And somehow both sides agreed. The Pig War, as it came to be known, had begun. Not with blood, but with boredom. With potato patches and paper maps. With overcooked rations and damp socks. With flags fluttering politely across a field. It would last 13 years. And not a single person, American or British, would die. Only the pig. But that's for the next section. For now, let the fog of San Juan Island curl around your thoughts. Let the absurdity and the tension settle like dust in a quiet room. A war that almost was. A place between 2 nations. And a pig who never knew what he started. Let's stay a little while. Consider yourself there. The year is 1859, late summer. You have just arrived on the southern shore of San Juan Island after stepping off a rickety wooden boat. Naturally, the sky is cloudy, and as you walk, the tall grasses brush against your boots and bend eastward in the wind. The American military camp is in front of you, strewn across a large, wide field. Not a fort, not a base, only a few tents and partially constructed buildings making a valiant effort to appear official. Captain George Pickett is standing there, walking close to the center, hands on his hips, chest puffed out like a rooster. Every silent moment is treated by Pickett as though it were a stage awaiting a monologue. He was brought here with 66 soldiers to make a statement, not to engage in combat. That point, the United States owns this land. He says it with assurance, dramatically, probably with theatrical twirls of mustache. He compensates for his lack of purpose clarity with volume. This was confusing to the British. Since 1853, the Hudson's Bay Company has operated here. For heaven's sake, they had a sheep farm. They had constructed fences, produced crops, salary payments. Not that they were squatting. Pickett, however, was unconcerned. The pig incident struck him as a spark, a rallying cry, an opportunity for America to make its presence known. The issue? Foreign policy was not his responsibility. The standoff then started. British Marines quickly set their camp on the north end of the island. Their tone was slightly different under the leadership of Captain Geoffrey Hornby. Hornby had no desire to fight. He merely wanted to warn the Americans that the border had not yet been formally decided, and to protect British citizens he couldn't give up. Though, you now have two camps on this small green island in the foggy Pacific. One Brit, just one American. They both got to work. Both were courteous. They were both rather perplexed as to how this had occurred. Nevertheless, life went on. The soldiers had no desire to engage in combat. They were mostly young, wet and cold, undernourished. They had been placed here to remain motionless, gaze across a clearing, and await potentially unattainable news. Not a bullet. No conflicts. Just uncomfortable closeness. And soon they started to do what humans do. Adapt. They played cards. They wrote letters home. They chopped wood. They traded. Yes, traded. British and American soldiers began bartering for tobacco, sweets, tools. Sometimes they helped each other haul supplies or fix broken things. They exchanged songs. Some of them even flirted with the same local women, though thankfully no duels broke out over that particular front. You could hear the sound of a fife from the British camp in the morning, followed by American bugle calls at noon. Each side drilled their men, marching, saluting, practicing. For what? They weren't sure. Meanwhile, local settlers watched this all with a kind of bemused fatigue. They still had pigs to feed, potatoes to dig, fences to repair. They went on with life as best they could, caught between the performance of power and the practicalities of island living. Some settlers were glad to have troops around. It meant their claims might be taken seriously. Others were annoyed. Soldiers were loud. They trampled fields. They borrowed things and forgot to return them. Children, of course, loved the spectacle. Imagine being 8 years old, growing up on a remote island where two nations have set up rival camps a few miles apart. You'd sneak off to watch the drills. Try to mimic the accents. Pretend you were the general of your own invisible army in the woods behind the barn. You wouldn't remember the names. You'd remember the energy. And you'd definitely remember the pig. Because by now, everyone was talking about it. The pig. As if it were a mythic creature. A beast that had single-handedly summoned empires to this out-of-the-way place. You could practically see the legend forming in real time. And lo, the mighty pig did feast upon the sacred roots of liberty, and thus awoke the thunder of distant nations. Except, it was just a pig. An animal with an appetite and unfortunate timing. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., the U.S. government was confused. Why had one of their officers occupied disputed territory without permission? Why was Britain threatening naval action over livestock? And more importantly, what on earth were they supposed to do about it? President James Buchanan, nearing the end of his unpopular term, didn't want a war. He had his hands full with sectional tensions, slavery debates, and the gathering clouds of civil war. So, when General Winfield Scott, the veteran soldier, 6 feet 5 inches and calm as a sunrise, offered to go west and fix it himself, Buchanan said, "Please do." Scott was perfect for this. He had been in the military longer than most of the soldiers on San Juan had been alive. He'd negotiated delicate peace treaties in Mexico, smoothed over land disputes in the South. He was deliberate, polite, and utterly unimpressed by the bravado of younger men like Pickett. When Scott arrived, he didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply listened. And then he proposed a solution so simple, so gentle, so thoroughly un-American in its lack of explosions, that both sides agreed instantly. Joint occupation. Each side would maintain a small garrison, no more than 100 men. They would not interfere with one another. They would both await final instructions from their governments. And they would behave like neighbors, at least civil neighbors. And so it began. A kind of military pause. Not peace, not war, just waiting. American soldiers planted gardens. They fished, they hunted, they tried to keep their boots dry. British soldiers tended their formal gardens, played cricket, read books aloud, took long, silent walks by the cliffs. No one was quite sure how long it would last. They just knew that until someone somewhere made a decision, this was the new normal. And the settlers? They got used to it. The island became a kind of gentle absurdity, an open-air performance of imperial patience. And as the months turned to years, and the years turned to decades, the Pig War, if you could call it that, settled into something almost beautiful. A story you told at the dinner table. A reason to laugh in a world that usually didn't leave much room for laughter. So as we leave this part of the story tonight, remember, the world didn't end. Flags were raised, but no rifles fired. The wind kept blowing across the fields. The potatoes regrew. The pig didn't make it, but its legacy did. A reminder that sometimes, in the long timeline of nations, the most heroic thing anyone can do is nothing at all. To choose patience. To let the moment pass without flinching. To stare across a disputed meadow and say, "We'll wait." And perhaps tonight, as you sink deeper into your blankets, into the slow drift of sleep, you can feel a little of that same stillness, that slow-burning calm, that island fog between two flags, where a pig once dug up potatoes and accidentally saved lives. Time doesn't go by as quickly on an island as it does in a city. Slowly, it rolls across the ocean like fog. Under your boots, it hums. It takes its delicious, pine-scented time, rustling in the branches. Additionally, the weeks became months, then years, for the soldiers based on San Juan Island, with the sluggish cadence of near war, rather than the clang of action. Let's take a deeper look. It is currently 1860. Although the American Civil War has not yet broken out, tensions are increasing in the East. In the meanwhile, the United States and Britain continue to share space on the island. On the southernmost tip of the island, there is an American camp where men are learning to live in a peculiar tension and tents are set in rows. Additionally, the British Royal Marines are based at what they refer to as English Camp in the north. They have more orderly quarters, more long-lasting. The drizzle makes the redcoats shine. Above a lavender and rose garden, the Union Jack slowly flaps. You might initially believe that this was still a risky circumstance. However, the atmosphere, more awkward roommate situation, less battlefield. Although both camps were aware that the other was observing, there were typically no altercations, conflicts, or even insults. Rather, the soldiers became accustomed to their routines. Morning routine. Let's begin with the morning. At American camp, reveille sounded at 5:30 a.m. sharp. Soldiers stirred from their canvas tents, boots clunking against the dew-damp ground. They lined up for roll call, then dispersed for coffee, grumbling about the cold. Their breakfast? Salt pork, hardtack, maybe a boiled potato if supplies had arrived recently. They ate standing up, in silence or with soft conversation, steam rising from their tin mugs as the fog thinned across the meadow. A mile away at English camp, a different scene. Here, the day began with the whistle of a kettle. Tea was made properly, poured carefully into china mugs shipped all the way from Britain. Breakfast included porridge or sometimes a bit of smoked fish. There was discipline, yes, but also a kind of ease. The British officers prided themselves on decorum, on ceremony, on maintaining the appearance of order, even in the middle of nowhere. The island rhythm. By midday, both camps had their routines. American soldiers chopped wood, cleaned rifles, dug ditches. There was a bit of drilling, but mostly it was maintenance. The men passed time repairing boots, playing cards, writing letters home. Many were from the Midwest or East Coast. Young men who'd signed up expecting frontier excitement, not fog and foot rot. British Marines, on the other hand, spent their afternoons tending gardens, grooming their horses, and perfecting their cricket swing. The officers organized readings of Charles Dickens and Shakespeare in the evenings. And through it all, the two sides watched each other, but not with anger. With curiosity. They even started to mingle. Not officially, of course, but fishermen from both camps would meet along the rocky shores and trade. A bit of tobacco for a fish, a story for a joke. Sometimes, soldiers wandered too far from camp and found themselves sipping tea in a tent that wasn't flying their flag. There are even letters from the time that mention joint dances. That's right. Imagine a foggy evening, music echoing across a field. Fiddler plays a tune. Soldiers from both sides mingle under makeshift lanterns, with settlers and local women watching or dancing along. There's cider, laughter. The air smells like pine smoke and roasted turnips. A war where the combatants throw parties. Let that image lull you a little deeper. Letters home. What did they write about? Many letters from San Juan soldiers have survived. They don't talk about glory or enemies. They talk about mud, about boredom, about how damp everything is. One U.S. private complained that his socks hadn't been dry in 4 months. Another, a British Marine, wrote to his sister, "This is the quietest war I've ever heard of. The Americans are pleasant enough chaps. We exchange eggs and tobacco more often than insults. It's absurd, and kind of beautiful, because instead of the usual rhythm of conquest, charge, clash, retreat, this story moves to a different beat. Wait, watch, brew tea, write letters, the settler's view." Of course, not everyone on the island wore a uniform. There were about 30 to 50 settlers, both British and American. Farmers, merchants, a few adventurous families with small children. People who had chosen this place not for politics, but for the land, green, fertile, surrounded by the deep blue of the Pacific. These people lived in between, not quite under American law, not quite British. When they needed to send a letter, they asked both camps which postal route would be faster that week. When a cow wandered too far, it might be corralled by a soldier in blue, or one in red. The settlers were often the true peacemakers. They helped smooth tensions, shared food, translated complaints. Occasionally, they rolled their eyes at the whole thing. To them, the pig war wasn't a standoff. It was a shared joke, a ridiculous, ongoing inconvenience they had to explain to every new visitor. The pig's legacy. And yes, the pig. Though its body was buried long ago, its memory lived on. Every few months, a new soldier would arrive and ask, "Wait, what are we doing here?" And someone would explain, "Well, there was a pig." Eyebrows would raise. Smiles would spread. It became a kind of legend. The kind of story you tell around a fire on a long night, between sips of bad coffee and starlit yawns. International patience. Meanwhile, back in the capitals, Washington and London, governments dragged their feet. There were bigger issues. Civil war erupted in the United States in 1861, pulling attention and resources far away from the misty little island in the Pacific. British attention, too, shifted elsewhere: India, Ireland, naval reforms. No one was in a rush to resolve the pig war. And so, it endured. 13 years of it. Think about that. 13 years where two world powers shared a tiny island, kept their distance, and didn't fire a single shot. 13 years of wet boots and tea kettles, of overlapping patrols and overlapping jokes. Let's stop here. Close your eyes. Picture a foggy evening on San Juan Island. The air smells of pine, salt, and sheep. Somewhere, a British officer is sketching the harbor. An American private is carving his name into a pine tree. A settler is roasting potatoes and humming a hymn. No one is fighting. No one is charging into battle. The wind sighs, and the night settles. And across the field, two flags flutter. Side by side, waiting, peacefully. Because sometimes, The world's most ridiculous problems can be solved not with force, but with time and patience. And maybe, just maybe, a shared cup of tea. Section 4. Let's take a stroll up the shore. It is now 1865. The bloody, agonizing conflict in the eastern United States has just come to a conclusion. The world is changing. Telecoms across continents click. The seas are dotted with steamships. A young country is grieving and changing after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. However, time continues to float here on San Juan Island. This slow-motion, peaceful standoff is still going on, called the Pig War, and San Juan turns into something peculiar. A haven of peace in the midst of a turbulent era, while the outside world burns and rebuilds. A green spot where two armies cultivate potatoes and have tea. A battle in which everyone waits but no one fires. Let's get back into the island's groove. Camp in America, 1865. Over time, the American camp has seen some changes. A simple officer's quarters and log barracks have taken the place of some of the tents. Now there's a real cookhouse, a parade ground trampled underfoot by innumerable boots. Though they still rotate out every few months, the men are more established and are beginning to accept the way things are. It is silent, boring, some might say. However, sometimes dull can be lovely. Drills and roll calls still begin each morning. However, the drills lack enthusiasm. Nobody thinks they'll be required. The rifles have been cleaned. The boots have been polished. All of this, however, seems to be more for show than purpose. What about in the afternoons? Fishing is available. Writing letters. Woodworking. Men use driftwood to carve miniature animals. Use dice to play games. According to reports, one officer wrote a play for 3 months, and it was subsequently played in the mess hall using flour sack costumes. The wind is another factor. The wind is always present. It sings through the tree branches, whips the tents, and rolls across the grass. It's as much a presence on this island as any person. English camp. North of the island, the British are just as settled. They've built gardens now, real ones, with flowers, herbs, vegetables. Neatly arranged beds lined with stones. Roses, foxglove, lavender. There's a small fountain, a pathway of crushed seashells. The officers take pride in it. They host teas there on calm afternoons. The Royal Marines live in barracks of hand-hewn timber, with wood stoves and proper chimneys. Their dining hall is clean, orderly, and decorated with portraits of the Queen and faded Union Jacks. There's a feeling that they've brought a piece of England with them, even if it's just in the form of sponge cake, polished boots, and a perfectly folded newspaper. One of the captains kept a diary. In it, he wrote, "If we must defend this island, I shall do so with sword in one hand and marmalade toast in the other." You can almost hear the dry chuckle behind the ink. Island society. And then there are the settlers. By now, more have arrived. Some are Americans seeking farmland. Others are British citizens working for the Hudson's Bay Company. A few are neither, just people who fell in love with the fog, the soil, or the sense of being somewhere slightly outside the world. There's a small schoolhouse now, a bakery, a general store that sells nails, tobacco, salt, and gossip in equal parts. A small chapel where both British and American settlers take turns leading Sunday prayers. Despite the division between camps, the community acts as a kind of bridge. Neighbors visit one another, borrow tools, exchange stories. Kids from both backgrounds play together in the fields, arguing over rules to games they all half remember. The island, while technically a disputed zone, is quietly building its own culture. No one writes it down, but everyone feels it. Celebrations in a divided land. What happens when holidays arrive? It depends on the flag you're under. On the 4th of July, the American soldiers fire off a few ceremonial rounds into the air. Just blanks. They barbecue salted beef, hang hand-painted bunting from the barracks, and sing old songs of independence while settlers bring pies and cider. And a few miles away, the British raise their own eyebrows, sip tea, and pretend not to be amused. But on Queen Victoria's birthday, the favor is returned. The Royal Marines line up, fire their own ceremonial volley, and host a garden party with scones and strawberry jam. Americans are, of course, unofficially invited. And they come, quietly, curiously, enjoying the music and clapping politely at the speeches. A war zone where both sides attend each other's birthday parties. That's the pig war, a soldier's perspective. Imagine you're a young man from Ohio. You joined the U.S. Army at 17 hoping for glory, or at least something interesting. They shipped you west. You marched. You rode. And now here you are, chopping wood, pulling weeds, watching the same 3 sheep wander across the parade ground every morning. Your uniform itches. Your boots leak. The fog makes your letters home damp before you even finish writing them. And yet, there's peace here. The kind of peace that doesn't shout. It just lingers. It softens you. You start sketching the mountains in your notebook. You teach a settler's child how to make a slingshot. You walk by the coast, where otters bob between kelp beds, and feel something you didn't expect. Calm. International eyes watching. Back in London and Washington, the issue of San Juan Island still hovered. Ambassadors exchanged notes. Maps were studied. And every few years, another commission was proposed, another round of letters. But no one could quite decide what to do. By now, neither side really wanted to give up the island. But neither wanted to fire the first shot either. And the longer it went on, the more absurd it all seemed. War over a pig? Really? A shared joke. Among the soldiers, the phrase "because of the pig" becomes shorthand. Why are we still here? Because of the pig. Why are we only allowed 1 cannon? Because of the pig. Why are we being so polite to the British today? Because of the pig. It becomes legend, a mascot, a myth. There's even a carved wooden pig that appears in one of the mess halls, placed proudly beside the flag. No one admits to making it, but everyone salutes it now and then. It watches over them like a very confused, slightly amused guardian spirit. Time moves on. By the end of the 1860s, the island is starting to feel more like home than battlefield. Soldiers are still rotated out, but many ask to stay longer. Some leave the military and become settlers themselves. They marry by land, raise sheep, and still the joint occupation continues. Still no final decision. Still no border drawn. But no one seems in a rush, because something has happened here, something delicate and rare. A place meant for conflict has become a kind of accidental peace project. A small, fog-wrapped experiment in coexistence. And all because of 1 pig. Some stories end quickly, with bang, clash, or final word. But others, especially the boring, beautiful ones, stretch slowly. They don't crash, they drift. And on San Juan Island, the pig war drifted into its 10th year. That's a decade of shared land, shared sky, shared confusion, and still no one had resolved the question, whose island is this? But if you were living there by 1870, you might have stopped caring about that. Not because it wasn't important, ownership, identity, law, but because life had taken over. You had children to feed, a roof to patch, grain to dry, boots to fix. Whether you flew a British or American flag, you still had to clean the outhouse and carry water from the spring. And the soldiers, now used to the rhythm of island peacekeeping, had learned something strange and powerful. It's possible to live in disagreement without violence. Routine now with familiar faces. At this point, some of the men stationed on the island had served multiple tours. They knew the terrain like the backs of their weathered hands. Knew the curve of every trail, the mood of every storm, the sound of their counterparts' bugles echoing faintly from across the field. They'd grown up on this island, in a way. They'd seen one another marry, mourn, celebrate. Exchanged letters. Traded meals. The line between us and them blurred gently, like fog over the fence posts. One American lieutenant wrote in his journal, "These redcoats are more neighbor than rival. I dare say I'd rather dine with Captain Browning than most of my cousins back in Ohio." It's not what war usually looks like. But maybe that's the point. Joint occupation becomes daily life. The soldiers weren't just guards anymore. They were part of the island's ecosystem. They helped build bridges, cleared trails, fixed roofs after windstorms. At harvest, they helped settlers bring in the wheat. During calving season, you'd find soldiers from both camps shoulder to shoulder, helping birth livestock, sleeves rolled, hands muddy. When a settler fell ill, both camps offered help. One British Marine with medical training once rode 6 miles through a storm to deliver medicine to an American child with pneumonia. And no one questioned it. It wasn't about flags anymore. It was about place. The island calendar. San Juan Island had developed its own unofficial calendar of events by now. There was the annual cricket match, British against Americans. Always spirited. Never finished. Usually abandoned halfway through for lack of interest or because someone brought cider. There was the midsummer bonfire, where settlers and soldiers all gathered by the southern bluff to roast whatever was left in the pantry. Sometimes lamb, sometimes wild berries, sometimes both, and sing songs that nobody quite remembered the words to. There were harvest suppers, chapel potlucks, and even the occasional winter snowball skirmish, where dozens of grown men in uniform flung snowballs instead of bullets. There was still a hint of tension. Sure, a British officer once said of a certain American captain, "He's entirely uncultured, but makes a fine biscuit." But even those barbs were gentle. The island had become a kind of unofficial peace village, suspended between nations. Remember the pig? Still, every so often, someone would point back to the beginning, to the pig. It had been dead for over a decade now, and yet its memory remained surprisingly alive. New recruits, arriving fresh from England or New York, would be pulled aside by veterans and told the story. "Right, lad, here's what you need to know. It all started with a pig. Ate the wrong potato. Got itself shot. Now you're standing here in the rain. So mind the sheep and don't insult the captain's tea." A joke, a lesson, a myth. Settlers told the story to their children like a fairy tale. Once upon a time, a pig dug where it shouldn't and nearly started a war. But instead, it planted a garden. British humor, American shrugs. The British officers, especially those from aristocratic families, began treating the pig war almost like a running joke in their letters home. One wrote, "Today I thwarted American expansion by attending their picnic and politely refusing a second scone." Another, "If we fire the cannon, it will be out of sheer boredom, possibly to celebrate a new potato." American soldiers responded in kind. "British boys brought marmalade. We brought sassafras. I call it even." The standoff became a kind of sport, a ritual performed not for conquest but for civility, a place where power didn't erupt. It brewed slowly, over low fires and with frequent apologies. The real diplomats. While soldiers and settlers found peace, the real answer still sat in the hands of diplomats. Maps were drawn, arguments made. In 1871, the Treaty of Washington was signed, not just about San Juan, but about a whole list of grievances between the US and Britain, including Civil War damages, fishing rights, and border disputes. And finally, after 25 years of vague stalling, the two countries agreed on something crucial. They would let a third party decide. Not a general, not a soldier, not a politician from either side, but a foreign monarch. And they chose Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. Yes, Germany, because nothing says peaceful resolution quite like outsourcing your pig-related problems to a Prussian emperor, preparing for a verdict. So now the soldiers waited for a different kind of news. Not orders, not threats, but an opinion. The evidence was gathered. Old maps, treaty notes, testimonies from officials, historical arguments that stretched back to sea charts, sailing lanes, and the poetic interpretation of the phrase, "the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island." The Kaiser's advisors spent months poring over it all. And on October 21st, 1872, the verdict came in. It was brief, polite, decisive. San Juan Island belonged to the United States. No shots, no war, no problem. And with that, it was over. No flags torn down.
No gundit pride.
No cannon fire. Just a handshake. The British packed up. The redcoats marched out. The Union Jack was lowered, slowly, with full honors. the American flag remained, flapping gently above the same patch of earth where the pig had once rooted around. And no one died. Not one soldier. Not one settler. Only that original hungry pig. The legacy of gentle conflict. You'd think such an outcome would fade quickly. The problem is that people do remember peace, particularly when it's uncomfortable, slow, almost ridiculous. The Pacific Northwest folklore includes the Pig War, a reminder that not all border conflicts result in fatalities. Some culminate in cricket contests and communal gardens, in potatoes and marmalade. To this day, it remains one of the few territorial conflicts in contemporary history to be settled without violence, without bombing, and, most oddly, with both parties feeling satisfied. The pig itself became a symbol in its own right, a reminder that something worthwhile may come from even the most absurd beginnings. Let's linger for a moment in October of 1872. The Kaiser's decision has arrived. The British are packing up, but not hurriedly. There's no shame here, no defeat, just closure. The kind that comes after a long, patient standstill. You can almost hear it in the wind, like a sigh, drifting across the fields and forests. The war that never really was is now officially not a war, and life on San Juan Island is about to change. But not all at once. If anything, the end came quietly. The British held a small ceremony. Their flag was lowered with full honors. A few tears were shed, not for a lost cause, but for a place they had come to love. Some officers had spent over a decade on this island. Some had married settlers. Some had raised gardens here that would outlive them. Let's start in a peaceful place. Somewhere among the mists. Somewhere you can hear the distant creak of old floors beneath boots and almost smell the sea salt in the air. Where the gray-wrapped sun comes late and the trees sway gently. It's the kind of setting where stories flow in like tidewater rather than shouting. San Juan Island is this. A piece of hazy earth that floats between the beaches of British Columbia and what is now Washington State. A location that was once the focal point of an international standoff, almost absent. The United States and Great Britain, two strong empires, are on the verge of war in 1859. The spark? A pig. Indeed, an actual pig. Not a code word for a complicated process. It's not a metaphor. Only a pig. A ravenous pig. One who has little knowledge of diplomacy, treaties, or borders. One having a regrettable potato hunger. But let's broaden our perspective before delving into the potato patch where it all began. Let's take a look at 1859. Let's experience it. RDLY. Because bullet points don't capture the essence of history. It is momentary, inbred and breath and silent anxieties. The Pacific Northwest is still new, wild, and uncarved at this very time. It has a smoke and cedar scent. Birdsong and the sounds of newcomers pounding together futures out of bare would fill the air. The United States is developing quickly to the south, with its lungs spreading westward. There will be trains soon. Wires on telegraphs buzz. However, tensions are also escalating as a result of division, expansion, and slavery. Although no one is aware of it yet, the nation is headed into civil war. British Canada is spread out over a wide area to the north. The Hudson's Bay Company, which is essentially a fur-clad business empire, continues to be a powerful influence. Above seaside commercial posts, the British flag is respectfully flown by officers with sharp uniforms and calmer dispositions. They weren't leaving a battlefield. They were leaving a kind of home. The last march. On November 25, 1872, the Royal Marines boarded their ships and sailed away. No cannon fire.
No cheating.
Just a slow departure. American soldiers watched from a distance. Many saluted. Some waved. A few shared flasks with their former counterparts the night before. And then, they were gone. For the first time in over a decade, the Americans had the island to themselves. But what now? Life after occupation. With the British gone, the American garrison remained for a time, though even they felt the changing wind. The original purpose of their presence had vanished with the Redcoats' departure. There was no one left to stand off against. No diplomatic drama. Just sheep, settlers, and the same salty air. Slowly, the soldiers were called elsewhere. Some were reassigned. Some left the service. A few stayed behind as civilians. And eventually, the fort itself, built slowly, lived in fully, and then emptied, was left quiet. Tents rotted. Barracks leaned. Winds rattled window frames. The military had moved on. But the island remained. What settlers remembered. The people who stayed, those who'd been here before the first soldier arrived, didn't talk much about occupation. They didn't remember the names of generals or the long letters from Washington or London. They remembered the weather, the dances, the peculiar friendships, the way the fog wrapped the island like a wool blanket every morning, the way the cannons were used more for firing blanks on birthdays than for anything serious. And they remembered the pig. Always the pig. It became a running joke in families. Mind the garden, or we'll end up at war like that old pig did. No second helpings until you can explain how one potato started an international crisis. Stories pass like that, not with accuracy, but with warmth. And so the pig lived on, not in muscle and snout, but in memory. A curious little war. Let's zoom out again. In the grand sweep of American history, the Civil War, the Trail of Tears, the Revolution, World War I, World War II, the Pig War barely even qualifies as a footnote. No one died. No monuments were built. No holidays created. But maybe that's why it matters. Because history tends to remember the loud moments, the victories, the horrors, the explosions. But just as real, just as human are the quiet chapters, the ones where people almost fought, and then didn't. The Pig War is history's way of saying, see, it doesn't have to end badly. It's a reminder that even in an age of conquest and expansion, of empires and manifest destinies, it is possible to choose patience, to argue without killing, to share a meadow instead of setting it on fire. The island settles down. In the years that followed, San Juan Island settled into its next identity. No longer a disputed zone, now just home. Farmers bought land. Children grew up. A post office opened. Schools were built. Life marched on with all the quiet clumsiness of any small town finding its rhythm. But echoes of the past lingered. Old barracks stood, slowly taken over by moss and rain. Garden beds once tended by British Marines were kept up by locals. And in some homes, tucked away in a drawer or behind glass, you could still find a faded photograph of a British officer smiling awkwardly beside an American farmer. The kind of photo where nobody's quite sure why they're standing together, but everyone's glad they are. Let's take a slow walk back. Not through fog this time, but through memory. Because every place that once held tension eventually fills with stories. And San Juan Island? It became one of the rarest kinds of historical spaces. A place where nothing violent happened, and yet everything changed. By the late 1800s, the island had officially become part of the United States. The maps were redrawn. The disputes settled. No one brought it up much anymore. But the legacy remained. The first pig war tourists. By the turn of the 20th century, a new kind of visitor started to appear. Not settlers, not soldiers, but tourists. People who had heard the tale about the pig, the potato patch, the polite armies, and wanted to see where it happened. They came in small groups, arriving by ferry, wearing wide hats and carrying picnic baskets. They walked the old fields, peered at the crumbling foundations of American camp and English camp, and imagined what it might have looked like when soldiers drilled politely under the rain. Some claimed they could still hear the faint sound of a bugle echoing across the hills. Others took home pebbles or pressed ferns as souvenirs. The story was taking root, not just in the island's soil, but in the nation's folklore. Schools start teaching it. In the early 1900s, a few teachers in Washington state began including the Pig War in their history lessons. Not because it was grand, but because it was gentle. A way to teach diplomacy, patience, humor. They asked their students to reenact the incident. One student would play the pig. Two others, the farmers. One would be the British naval officer. Another, George Pickett. They'd argue. They'd overreact. And then, they'd all share a cookie and agree to joint occupation. It was absurd. It was brilliant. And it stuck. Children remembered it better than any battle date or presidential trivia. official recognition. In 1966, San Juan Island's two historic military camps, American Camp and English Camp, were officially declared part of San Juan Island National Historical Park. Today, you can walk those same fields, stand under the flagpole, visit the old garden where British officers once sipped tea, read letters, touch cannon barrels that were never fired in anger. There are trails now, wooden signs, benches placed exactly where the soldiers used to sit and stare across the field. And most importantly, there are stories told in a whisper. Tour guides speak softly, respectfully, almost reverently. Not because the island saw horror, but because it didn't. Because peace, when it lasts, deserves to be honored too. The pig's unlikely immortality. And what of the pig? The pig has no statue. There's no plaque for it. No grave marked with a name or year. But in the gift shop, you'll find little wooden pigs. Keychains. T-shirts that say, "I came for the war. I stayed for the pig. Veteran of the pig war, 0 confirmed kills. Ask me about the potato that almost started a war." Tourists laugh. Children giggle. And somewhere, in whatever afterlife pigs deserve, that anonymous black Berkshire might just be grunting in amusement. A pig that never knew it would go down in history, that simply followed its nose and nudged the world a little more gently. Let's pull the map back out. Not the paper one, the one in your mind. Picture the border between the United States and Canada. It runs for over 5,500 miles, the longest unmilitarized boundary in the world.
No fences. No tanks. No barbed wire.
Just woods, rivers, fields, and, every so often, a quiet little checkpoint where someone might ask you where you're headed and offer a half-smile. It wasn't always this peaceful, but the pig war? It helped make it that way. A turning point in silence. You see, up until the mid-1800s, the US and British North America, which would become Canada, had a rocky relationship. The War of 1812, border tensions in Maine, disputes over fishing rights. And yet, by the time the pig war came along, something had changed. Both sides hesitated, not because they didn't care, but because they were beginning to realize there might be a better way. Instead of fighting over foggy islands and ambiguous phrases in dusty treaties, maybe, just maybe, you could talk. Wait, breathe. Even if it meant years of awkward joint occupation. The pig war as a template. Diplomats later pointed to the pig war as a model of nonviolent resolution. In internal memos, in speeches, in private letters, it was the story they brought out when someone wanted to saber rattle. They'd say, "Remember the pig? Let's not do this again." And the idea took root. After 1872, no major military confrontation ever occurred again between the US and what would become Canada. No shots fired across the border. No troop buildups.
No incursions.
Instead, quiet treaties, shared lakes, even shared embassies eventually. The longest peaceful border on Earth owes a bit of its calm to a pig that got curious about potatoes. Shared laughter between neighbors. As the decades passed, Americans and Canadians began to treat the pig war not as a threat, but a punchline. Newspapers ran cartoons in the early 20th century showing uniformed soldiers saluting a pig. Local Canadian radio stations told the tale every year on Canada Day, always with a wink. American classrooms included it as a humorous break between the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. And quietly, sweetly, it became a kind of shared memory. Something both countries could smile about. A reminder that, at least once in history, two powers stood toe-to-toe, and then both stepped back, shrugged, and had a picnic instead. George Pickett's Post-Pig Path. Let's take a small detour to a familiar name. George Pickett. Yes, that Pickett. The same man who, in 1859, had been sent to San Juan Island with bluster and bravado, shouting for war over a pig. He would later become a Confederate general in the US Civil War. And in 1863, at the Battle of Gettysburg, he would lead the infamous Pickett's Charge. A massive doomed assault that helped decide the fate of the war. Thousands died in that charge. And the irony? The only command Pickett ever gave in a fully peaceful context was on San Juan Island. when he called for troops to defend American honor against the scourge of a hungry pig. The Pig War and national personality. In a strange way, the Pig War came to symbolize something more than just a border dispute. It became a story of character. For Americans, it reflected the spirit of individual stubbornness. For Brits and Canadians, it echoed the art of polite restraint. And in the middle of that, there was a pig, unaligned, apolitical, just a hungry. What a perfect metaphor. Echoes in pop culture. Over the years, the Pig War made cameos. A play in 1937, One Potato Too Many, a Canadian folk song in the 1950s with the chorus. He came for a snack, and he started a spat. Oh, the pig in the garden knew that. Even a 1980s children's book, Percival the Pig Who Wanted Peace, where the pig ends up as a UN diplomat. Sure, most of these are long forgotten, but the tone of them? Soft, silly, surprisingly tender. They don't glorify generals. They don't dig into treaties. They tell the story like a bedtime fable. Once, two great nations came very close to fighting over a pig, and then they didn't. And the world turned a little more gently that day. Let's wander now into the present. You've heard the fog-drenched stories of the past. The camps, the potato patch, the cannons that never fired. But what about now? What remains? What echoes? Let's walk the island again. Not in 1859, but in your imagination of today. San Juan Island now. Drive or ferry into San Juan Island in the modern age, and the first thing you'll notice is the quiet. Stillness lives here. Fields roll gently toward pine forests. Sheep nibble at the edges of roads. Small shops sell local honey and historical postcards. There's Wi-Fi, yes, but you get the sense that the signal strength of the past might still be stronger here. And on the southern tip, not far from the crashing surf, sits American camp. Grass-covered, open, surrounded by birdsong and wind. You can walk the parade ground where picket once stood, where soldiers once argued over pig justice, and where no battle ever happened. And then, a short drive to the north? English camp. More formal, still ringed by its garden, still flying the Union Jack. Not in ownership, but in remembrance. You can stand between the two and realize this was never really about territory. It was about tone. Ranger tours and tea. Park rangers now give daily tours in the summer. They're trained in the full timeline, from treaties to tea parties. They wear forest green, carry binders, and gently shepherd small crowds across the meadows. They tell stories not with drama, but with warmth. Sometimes they even serve tea at English camp. Guests sip chamomile while looking out over the bay, and listen to stories of 19th century boredom, bartering, and rain. Children sketch pigs on their visitor brochures. Elderly couples hold hands. The air feels full not with history's weight, but its grace. A flag that flew for peace. Near the restored blockhouse at American camp, there's a tall white pole where the American flag flies. It ripples in the wind. Visitors take photos beneath it. But for those who know the story, it means more than just America was here. It means we waited. We didn't fire. We talked. The flag that flew over the Pig War doesn't symbolize victory. It symbolizes restraint. And that's rarer than most people realize. The pig still wanders. Locals love to joke that the ghost of the pig still wanders the island. Some claim he can be seen rooting behind the bakery on foggy mornings. Others say he appears in dreams to tourists who spend the night near American camp. A black Berkshire with intelligent eyes and a faint smirk. It's silly, sweet, but somehow it fits. Because the pig, whoever he was, left behind a strange kind of legacy. One that made two nations pause, breathe, and agree to disagree with remarkable patience. The power of almost. There are many wars you can study in the textbooks. Wars with dates, casualties, battle plans. But the Pig War is different. It's the story of an almost. It almost became a crisis. Almost became a fight. Almost dragged two young nations into conflict. And in that almost, we find something powerful. A moment where the world chose calm. And now, more than 150 years later, that choice still echoes, quietly, gently. across an island where the sheep graze, the fog drifts, and the cannons remain beautifully unused. The art of not fighting, lessons from a forgotten standoff. Let's sit with the silence for a moment. The kind of silence that comes after long years of waiting, after cannons are packed away, after boots stop drilling, after flags are folded, and the uniforms are retired. It's the silence of resolution, but not through conquest, through something older, softer, less praised but deeply human, the act of restraint. The Pig War didn't just resolve a border dispute. It modeled a kind of peaceful stubbornness, a willingness to show up, show strength, and then not use it. Let's explore what it means to almost go to war, and then choose not to, when the smoke never came. We live in a world full of stories about war, heroic charges, terrible losses, flags waving over scarred battlefields. But rarely do we hear about the wars that never happened, the ones that stayed behind the curtain, the moments of political pressure that built, and then diffused. No songs are written for those, no statues built, just silence, and a little breeze in the grass. But those stories exist, and the Pig War is one of them. The forgotten skill, de-escalation. In 1859, when tensions rose on San Juan Island, both sides had every reason to escalate. They had legal claims, military assets, leaders with egos, and yet, something strange happened. They waited, they stalled, they wrote letters, they shared tea, not because they were weak, but because they were tired, because they'd seen what war could do, and weren't eager to replicate it over livestock. Think about that for a moment. In a world that often sees strength as action, charging, shouting, marching, it takes a different kind of courage to say, let's not. The diplomats' patience. Back in London and Washington, there were meetings, letters, gentle protests, but no ultimatums. No warships launched in fury. Why? Because the diplomats were learning, too. They were learning that in international affairs, delay isn't always failure. Sometimes it's strategy, letting tempers cool, letting facts settle, letting stories shift from headline to anecdote. By allowing the Pig War to stretch year after year, the crisis slowly melted. It wasn't solved overnight. It didn't need to be. Time did what cannonballs couldn't, changed the stakes, lowered the heat, made room for a solution. The soldiers who watched instead of fired. Now imagine being a soldier stationed on San Juan Island during those years. Every day you wake up in uniform, drill your drills, clean your weapon, watch the tree line, and nothing happens. First, you're restless. You signed up for something, action, honor, a career. Instead, you're peeling potatoes, trading jokes with the enemy, helping deliver babies, planting turnips. And slowly, a thought creeps in. Maybe this is the better outcome. Because those friendships, they're real. That child who waves at you every morning, she knows your name. And if war ever came now, it wouldn't just mean strategy. It would mean hurting people whose voices you know. Absurdity as a deterrent. There's something else at play here, too. Something deeply human. Let's start in a peaceful place. Somewhere among the mists. Somewhere you can hear the distant creak of old floors beneath boots and almost smell the sea salt in the air. Where the gray-wrapped sun comes late and the trees sway gently. It's the kind of setting where stories flow in like tidewater rather than shouting. San Juan Island is this. A piece of hazy earth that floats between the beaches of British Columbia and what is now Washington State. A location that was once the focal point of an international standoff, almost absent the United States and Great Britain, two strong empires, are on the verge of war in 1859. The spark? A pig. Indeed, an actual pig. Not a code word for a complicated process. It's not a metaphor. Only a pig. A ravenous pig. One who has little knowledge of diplomacy, treaties, or borders. One having a regrettable potato hunger. But let's broaden our perspective before delving into the potato patch where it all began. Let's take a look at 1859. Let's experience it. RDLY. Because bullet points don't capture the essence of history. It is momentary, in bread and breath and silent anxieties. The Pacific Northwest is still new, wild, and uncarved at this very time. It has a smoke and cedar scent. Birdsong and the sounds of newcomers pounding together futures out of bare would fill the air. The United States is developing quickly to the south, with its lungs spreading westward. There will be trains soon. Wires on telegraphs buzz. However, tensions are also escalating as a result of division, expansion, and slavery. Although no one is aware of it yet, the nation is headed into civil war. British Canada is spread out over a wide area to the north. The Hudson's Bay Company, which is essentially a fur-clad business empire, continues to be a powerful influence. Above seaside commercial posts, the British flag is respectfully flown by officers with sharp uniforms and calmer dispositions. The absurdity of it all. A pig eats potatoes. A man shoots it. Another man demands justice. And somehow this spirals into international tension. The longer it went on, the more ridiculous it seemed. And that ridiculousness, it became a kind of pressure valve. Both nations started to laugh at the situation, if only quietly. And that laughter became a reason not to escalate. Because how do you justify war when even your own soldiers are calling it the pig war? How do you explain to grieving families that their loved one died over someone's vegetable garden? You don't. So instead, you step back. You share the joke. And in doing so, you preserve the peace. The longest, most polite disagreement. The joint occupation of San Juan Island lasted over a decade. More than 10 years of low-key tension. More than 10 years of not pulling the trigger. That's a long time to keep a face-off going without letting it boil over. And yet, they did. Because peace wasn't an accident. It was something both sides chose day after day. They chose to keep the cannons clean, but unfired. Keep the uniforms sharp, but the hands open. Keep the flags waving, but the tempers cool. Peace, it turns out, is something you maintain like a garden. It doesn't bloom on its own. It requires patience, trimming, trust, and sometimes a very long waiting game. The power of delay. Think about it. The pig war wasn't won by brilliant tactics. It was resolved by waiting, talking, letting time pass. In an age where everything seems urgent, where headlines flash by in seconds and arguments go from zero to chaos in minutes, that feels revolutionary. The pig war reminds us that not everything demands an instant reaction. That sometimes you let a pig be a pig, and sometimes you let a disagreement be unresolved for a little while, until people can see it clearly. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Why it still matters. You might be wondering why any of this matters now. Why we're still whispering about a pig, 2 potato patches, and an island of fog. Because this story isn't about a border. It's about a mindset. In every generation, there are moments when people stand at a crossroads. They can raise fists or extend hands. They can act fast, or wait just a little longer. They can respond with fire, or with a smirk and a cup of tea. The pig war is a tiny, quiet reminder that we always have a choice. Even when the pig gets out. Even when the garden is ruined. Even when everyone's mad and no one agrees. We can still say, let's just share the island a little longer. A bedtime kind of war. And maybe, just maybe, that's why this story works so well at bedtime. Because unlike the other chapters in your history book, this one doesn't end in smoke. It ends in laughter, quiet goodbyes, sheep grazing where soldiers once stood, and one nameless pig who accidentally taught the world a little something about peace. So as you drift off tonight, you can let your mind wander back to San Juan Island. The soft rain, the sea wind, the uniforms flapping on the line, and know that sometimes the best kind of war is the one that never really begins. How America's most courteous national memory was created by the pig war. Let's pause for a moment. We've walked carefully across potato fields and foggy meadows, traversed decades, and followed the hushed footsteps of non-firing soldiers. We now discuss what the pig war evolved into after it was over, not in the present but in people's minds, in the manner that America and Canada recalled it. Due to the pig war's persistence, silently, almost comically, it changed into something completely different. A story to put to bed for a restless country. The conflict that turned into a fable. The majority of conflicts are recalled in black and white. Evil versus good. Win or lose. There are villains and heroes, maps and dates, death tolls. But not this one. The pig war slipped, almost effortlessly, into the realm of fable. Not because it wasn't real, because it was too real to take seriously. Because it ended not with bang or victory march, but with a shrug. And that shrug somehow stuck. People started to tell the story not like a history lesson, but like a folk tale. You know the kind. There once was a pig who crossed the wrong garden. Two mighty nations got very upset. But in the end, they drank tea and went home. Simple, soft, oddly profound. A lesson hidden in humor. There's something about the story that makes people smile. Even now, generations later, school kids giggle when they hear it. A pig? Really? Over a potato? It feels so delightfully beneath the dignity of war. And that's exactly why it matters. Because it teaches something that textbooks rarely can. That not every conflict needs a dramatic resolution. That humor can hold truth. That diplomacy doesn't have to be dry. When you laugh at the pig war, you're also learning about what war isn't. And that's a powerful thing. The pig as a symbol. By the early 20th century, the pig from the pig war, long dead, unnamed, buried in someone's memory, had become a mascot of sorts. A little ambassador of absurdity, of calm. Political cartoons showed it wearing a general's hat. Postcards featured it sniffing politely at a treaty. In the 1920s, a commemorative teapot was produced with a pig-shaped handle. In the 1950s, school teachers in Seattle used wooden pig puppets to explain territorial negotiations. Even the U.S. Army mentioned it in training manuals as a case of nonviolent military resolution. This pig had no idea it would be remembered longer than some presidents. Telling the story at bedtime. Let's fast forward to modern times. Imagine you're a parent in Oregon or Vancouver. Your child can't sleep. They're restless, twitching under the covers, mind buzzing. You don't want to frighten them with talk of war and fire, but you want to teach them something real. A long time ago, two neighbors had a disagreement, not over gold or glory, over a pig. And instead of fighting, they decided to wait. It works. The child blinks slower. The story unfolds like fog over a quiet island. They drift off wondering how it all ended with sheep and silence. This is what the pig war became. A gentle reminder that peace is possible. Even when it's silly. Even when it starts with pork. Why we hold on to this story, you might ask. With all the drama in history, battles, revolutions, assassinations, why does this little story survive? Because it's rare. It's proof that people, even back then, even in full uniform with muskets loaded, can choose something else. Can pause. Can say, let's wait. Let's not ruin this garden over principle. And maybe that's the kind of story we need more of. Pilgrimages to peace. Today, visitors still walk the grassy hills of San Juan Island. They whisper the story to each other like a secret. Some come expecting ruins, drama, a battlefield. What they find is stillness, a flag waving gently, a cannon that's never been fired in war, a trail where two enemies once traded bread. And they leave not amazed by what happened, but by what didn't. That's the legacy. That's what people carry home. A quiet story, a little shrug, and a pig that walked straight into a moment of near history. A location that selected peace and its residents, however. Let's take another stroll back to San Juan Island. Not as combatants, as historians, no, as guests, wondering, I'm tired. I wonder what's still there. Because the earth remembers even though the history is ancient. The people also do. Residents with deeply held memories. Many of the island's current residents have been here for many generations. The pig narrative has been told to them since they were young. From porches, not from textbooks, tables for dinner, ferry rides and bar stools. Some people can still identify the location of the potato patch. They will say, "Over there, near the orchard, that's where the pig did its damage." And they'll laugh, not because they're mocking the past, but because it feels so lovably human. These aren't people obsessed with war. They're caretakers of almost war. And that's something different altogether. Living with a peaceful legacy. There are two historic sites on the island, American Camp and English Camp. Both are preserved by the National Park Service. Both are still remarkably intact. But they aren't like other forts. There are no bullet holes to trace. No mass graves. No tales of last stands. Instead, you'll find neatly tended gardens, empty parade grounds, a Union Jack still raised once a day at English Camp, out of respect. A replica pig statue that children pet like it's a local hero. It's not a battlefield. It's a reminder that war is not inevitable. That peace, even boring peace, can leave its own kind of monument. Park rangers as storytellers. If you go in summer, you'll meet the rangers. They wear green, speak softly, and love the story like it's their own. They don't recite facts so much as tell bedtime tales. And the people listening, they lean in, they smile. Even teenagers put their phones away. Because when someone says, "Let me tell you how two countries almost went to war over a pig," you stay for the end. It's not just historical. It's personal. Children still learn it. Schools in Washington still teach the pig war. Not in fear but with fun. Some assign skits. Others write songs. One fourth-grade class built a miniature San Juan island and held a mock negotiation in the library. No one gets detention. Everyone eats potato chips after. And through the laughter, through the silliness, a quiet lesson sinks in. Patience works. Artists, writers, dreamers. The island has become a small magnet for artists, too. Writers come to walk the trail where George Pickett once paced. Poets write sonnets to a pig they never met. One local ceramicist makes tiny pig figurines, hand-painted with gold leaf, and sells them as ambassadors of quiet diplomacy. You can buy one and keep it on your desk. A little reminder not to send that angry email just yet. A landscape that doesn't rush. Even the island's geography supports the theme. The hills are soft. The fog is thick. The sea is always a little gray, a little poetic. There are no sharp cliffs here.
No raging rivers.
Just long, slow trails. And as you walk them, your thoughts start to soften. You forget the headlines. You forget the inbox. And you start to think, if they could take 10 years to decide over a pig, maybe I can wait a week before reacting to that thing my uncle said at dinner. This place teaches you to pause. Even without speaking. Why boring history might be the best kind. The pig war isn't flashy. It doesn't have explosions or dramatic last words. It has pig, a garden, two confused empires, and a long, rainy wait. But maybe that's why it lasts. Because in a world full of noise, a story this quiet stands out. Because it reminds us that boredom isn't bad. It's where patience lives. That sometimes the slowest history is the strongest. From conflict to curiosity, how the pig war affected our recollection of arguments. We have discussed the pig in a tactful manner. Regarding the island. Regarding the generals and their leisurely pause. However, when the finish draws near, it's time to consider something a bit more expansive. Beyond the woods and the gentle sound of the waves lapping on San Juan Island's shore, let's examine the concept of memory. Not just what we recall, but also how. Because the pig war is not merely an oddity of 1859. It has evolved into a template that is ingrained in our perception of arguments. The pig war in international relations classes. It might surprise you to learn that the pig war is still taught, not just in history classes, but in schools of diplomacy. Professors lean on it when teaching conflict resolution. They highlight it in slides between the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. They ask students questions like, how do you apply the pig war mindset to modern borders? What makes a standoff end without casualties? What role does embarrassment play in diplomacy? And, of course, what would you have done if you were the one holding the musket? That last one always makes the room pause, because when the threat feels small, your instinct might be to dismiss it or to lash out. But what the pig war teaches is this: you don't always have to prove you're right immediately. Sometimes you just have to wait for the right fog to clear. A story we tell ourselves about who we are. Americans and Canadians both tell the pig war story, but they tell it slightly differently, like neighbors who remember a shared childhood prank, but from opposite ends of the hallway. Americans tend to emphasize George Pickett's boldness, the defense of settlers, the show of readiness. Canadians, or more precisely British colonial narratives, tend to highlight Captain Hornby's restraint, the calm naval presence, the choice to wait. Both sides are correct, because what we see in the story is often what we want to be. Assertive but reasonable, brave but restrained, firm but fair. The pig war gives both nations a version of themselves that feels proud, but not boastful. A conflict that makes you look good by not doing much at all. And in a world where memory often clings to violence, this peaceful standoff feels refreshingly decent. Reenactments and festivals. Every few years, San Juan Island hosts a commemorative event. There are no cannon salutes. There are no fake battles. Instead, there's usually a ceremonial raising of both the British and American flags. A reenactment of the fateful potato patch moment. Someone dressed in a large, very unthreatening pig costume. Children in little red coats and blue jackets pretending to argue politely over territory. And afterward, everyone gathers for tea and lemonade. That's it.
No winners. No gralles.
Just the slow performance of a war that never really happened, reenacted as a kind of gentle joke the world was lucky to share. Not every war needs a monument. You can walk through DC and see memorials for many things. Sacrifice, glory, tragedy. But you won't find a grand obelisk for the pig war.
No marble pigs. No eternal flamme.
No stone general staring into the distance, chin up, saber drawn. Because the pig war didn't ask for any of that. It left behind something quieter. A restored officer's quarters. A cannon with no scars. A few weather-worn plaques. And stories carried by locals who smile when they tell them. That's the kind of monument that doesn't erode. Because it lives in people, not granite. The psychology of almost. The human brain is funny when it comes to memory. It tends to amplify extremes, either enormous tragedy or huge triumph. But there's another kind of memory that lingers even deeper. The ones that almost happened. The missed accident. The unsent text. The argument you almost had but decided wasn't worth it. The pig war fits into that category. We remember it not because it was dramatic, but because it was almost dramatic. And that gives it emotional weight. A sort of relieved breath in the long, noisy archive of history. Holding space for humor in history. Here's a secret not all historians will admit. History can be funny, even the serious bits. Because people, no matter the century, were still people. They got petty, confused, hungry, jealous, sleepy, and sometimes pigs got out. When you start telling the pig war story, you'll notice the smiles it brings. People sit a little straighter, their shoulders ease, because humor makes space for empathy. And that's what this story really offers. Not just peace, but a laugh shared across time. Sometimes we look into this mirror to decide what to quarrel about and what to let go of. Why the pig war is still important. Nearly a war, always a lesson today. We have been on the fields. The borders have been traced. We have seen animals straying in the wrong places and troops standing down. We're almost at the end now. But before we wrap up, let's pose a straightforward query. Why is this narrative relevant today? In a world that seems so loud, why are we murmuring it like a lullaby? Because there is a timeless wisdom in the pig war. It's more than just a humorous story. It's a mirror. It gives us a glimpse of what conflict looks like when it stops. When diplomacy listens, it sounds like this, and what it feels like to choose peace consciously. Conflict is a choice. One of the most important things to remember about the pig war is that it didn't need to end peacefully. Could have gone the other way. The troops were there. The ships were waiting. The cannons were aimed. All the ingredients for tragedy were in place. And yet nothing happened. That was a choice. Not once, but dozens of times. Made by commanders, settlers, diplomats, even ordinary citizens. They all chose again and again to let the moment cool. That's a rare thing in history, and it's even rarer today. But it's not gone. It's just quiet, like a pig in the fog. The forgotten strength of embarrassment. Here's something no textbook says out loud. Sometimes peace happens because war would just be too embarrassing. Could you imagine the newspapers? US invades over bacon bandit. Canada threatens retaliation after pig ambush. Treaty torn up over tubers. Both sides knew that if things escalated, it would be hard to explain and harder to justify. So they didn't. In a weird way, being a little bit ridiculous kept everyone safe. That's not a failure. That's a win. Modern conflicts and ancient pigs. You can't apply the pig war logic to everything. Not every disagreement is about vegetables and fences. But still, there's something in it for today's world. Because even now, people dig in over details. Nations argue over borders. Neighbors feud over noise and hedges and headlines. The pig war reminds us that not everything needs escalation. Some things can be solved with delay, with time, with a sigh instead of a shout. And maybe, in some small corner of the modern world, that story is still saving people from making things worse. A legacy of restraint. The pig war didn't give us a treaty that shaped the globe. It didn't produce a genius general. It didn't invent anything. What it gave us was a pattern. Possibility. That restraint could be remembered, too. That doing nothing on purpose could echo just as loudly as doing something rash. That's the part that lingers. Because it's so easy to forget. And so important to remember. The final gift. Stillness. As we reach the end of this tale, think about what stayed with you. Not the politics. Not the dates. But the feeling. The quiet camp. The cold mornings. The two flags flying just far enough apart. The pig, snuffling in the dirt, unaware that he almost caused a war. This is not a history of movement. It's a history of holding still. And in a world constantly trying to rush you into a side, a stance, an answer, maybe what we need most is one small reminder from 1859. That peace can look like waiting. That wisdom can sound like nothing at all. The pig that whispered, a farewell to an unfought war. There's something magical about the quiet ending. The story that doesn't blaze to a crescendo. The war that fizzles instead of flares. The soldier who turns back without firing. And in this story, this curious tale of a pig, two nations, and a peaceful standoff, we've arrived at that most delicate of endings. Nothing. No bloodshed. No declarations. No victory songs or surrender speeches. Just grass growing where boots once marched. Just fog rising from the trees. Just the soft echo of a pig's grunt. Like a misplaced period at the end of a very long and unwritten sentence. Let's take our time now and slowly, gently drift toward the last chapter. Not with answers, but with invitations to reflect. The island now. San Juan Island hasn't changed much. There are more bicycles now, of course. The ferry service runs like clockwork. There's a good coffee shop in Friday Harbor that sells baked goods shaped like pigs. An affectionate nod to history. But the land, it still holds its silence. On some mornings, if you walk alone along the southern cliffs, you'll hear nothing but the wind. The same wind that once lifted both the American and British flags, standing politely apart, waving without menace. The trails remain. The camps, preserved. The old parade grounds are now perfect places for quiet picnics and pondering. Children play where soldiers once stood. And a visitor from either nation, American, Canadian, or otherwise, can wander between the sites without a passport or a worry. There are no checkpoints, no fences, just paths. And isn't that lovely? That this almost war left behind nothing but walking trails? What the pig never knew. Let's return for a moment to the pig. The poor creature at the center of this unlikely universe. He had no name as far as records tell us. He was someone's pig, then someone else's nuisance, and then, somehow, the symbolic tipping point of an international dispute. He never stood trial. He never knew what he'd done. He just did what pigs do, followed a smell, ate some potatoes, got shot for his trouble, and yet, in a strange twist of fate, he did more than many kings or presidents ever managed. He paused a war, not on purpose but still paused it. And in that pause, in that breath between escalation and absurdity, people had time to reconsider. The pig, in his oblivious way, became the world's strangest peace envoy. You won't find a statue of him in Washington, or a mural in Ottawa, but maybe you should. Maybe a sleepy bronze pig in front of a courthouse would serve us better than another marble general on horseback. Just a reminder, pause. You don't know how far this could go. The dream of soft power. We live in an age that often values noise, loud victories, harsh opinions, speedy conclusions. But the pig war offers something subtler, soft power, the kind that whispers instead of shouts, that delays rather than demands, that holds the line, but draws it in chalk, not blood. And isn't that a kind of strength? To refuse to be baited, to stand firm without standing tall, to say, let's wait, instead of let's go. Both nations, Britain and the United States, exercised this form of power on San Juan Island. Not perfectly, not always with clarity, but with enough patience to prove something important, that not fighting can be the braver choice. What the soldiers left behind. They packed up, eventually. The British, after arbitration, finally gave the island to the US in 1872, folded their tents, lowered their flag, boarded their ships and left. The Americans stayed a while longer, then drifted off as well. And they left behind more than buildings. They left a garden of herbs still blooming near English camp. Journal entries tucked into museum drawers, filled with small talk and sketches of wildlife. Fences mended not out of duty, but out of boredom. Friendships with locals, quiet handshakes, shared cups of tea. You can almost feel them still. Not in ghostly form, no, this isn't that kind of story, but in gesture. In the way the wind passes through trees that once shaded board sentries. In the slow rhythm of a place that learned, over time, how not to rush into conflict. The diplomats who trusted time. Back in the capital cities, far from potato fields and grazing pigs, the diplomats kept their letters slow. This wasn't a crisis to be settled by telegram. It was a tea-drinking, cigar-smoking sort of argument. A we'll circle back next quarter kind of war. When they finally handed the dispute over to Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany for arbitration. Yes, truly, the Kaiser himself, it took 3 more years to reach a conclusion. Imagine that. An emperor, ruling a continent away, taking 3 years to decide who owned a foggy island with sheep on it. And when he chose, giving San Juan to the US, the British nodded, the Americans saluted, and everyone went on with their lives. Because by then, the anger had long since blown out to sea. It's hard to stay furious when you've been waiting for a verdict longer than some children wait to learn how to walk. What we learn from absurdity. It's tempting to laugh the pig war away, and that's fine. Laughter belongs here. But if you look past the absurdity, you'll see something deeper. The absurdity saved it, kept tempers low. It made escalation feel silly. It gave both sides room to back down without losing face. The pig became a pressure release valve. And maybe that's a lesson we can use elsewhere. When conflict rises between people, between nations, perhaps it helps to name the pig in the room. To recognize the part of the story that doesn't make sense. And then, with a breath, with a pause, with a cup of tea in hand, step back. Let the ridiculousness remind you, this doesn't have to get worse. A story to tell again and again. Stories like this don't expire. They just wait to be remembered again. Told in dorm rooms by history majors. Whispered in tents by tired soldiers learning de-escalation. Written into bedtime books with watercolor pigs and smiling generals. The pig war is a story you can share. Because it doesn't threaten. It doesn't demand sides. It invites you in. And as you retell it, as the details soften and shift, the core stays the same. Once we almost went to war, but instead we waited and drank tea. and raised sheep, and let the pig have the last word. A final walk through the island. If you ever go to San Juan Island, take your time. Don't rush through the history center. Don't sprint from American camp to English camp. Instead, walk. Pause at the tall grasses where the pig met his fate. Stop at the lookout where two nations once watched each other from across a small bay. Sit under a tree that likely shaded both redcoats and bluecoats alike. And listen to the breeze, to the sheep, to the birds calling in languages older than borders. Because here, in this tiny corner of the Pacific, something happened. Or rather, something didn't. And that not happening shaped the world just a little. As you drift off, now, while you close your eyes, consider this island. It was foggy, touched with salt. Keep quiet. No monuments clamoring for visibility. A battlefield no longer echoes with agony. Just tranquility, earned by inaction rather than coercion. Consider that pig. Consider the diplomats who were patient. Consider the soldiers who, rather than using musket fire, shared meals. Allow it to get ingrained in your bones. Because history isn't all that dull. It is the type that teaches you how to get a better night's sleep, how to argue more tactfully, how small things can remain small. And you might think about the island when tomorrow offers its own conflicts. The garden, the pig, and decide to wait just once. The conclusion. Rest well now, traveler. The conflict did not occur. It's also a peaceful night.